There's something crucial about spiritual awakening that most teachers won't tell you. Carl Jung discovered it through decades of research and his own harrowing journey. Awakening doesn't just expand consciousness, it can destabilize your entire psychological structure if approached incorrectly. He called it the confrontation with the unconscious, and he believed it contained genuine risks that everyone on the spiritual path needs to understand. Today, I'm revealing the hidden dangers Jung identified in spiritual awakening, not to discourage your journey, but to help you navigate it safely. Because Jung discovered that the difference between transformation and psychological crisis often comes down to understanding these specific dangers and knowing how to work with them. Here's what Jung understood that changes everything. Spiritual awakening activates powerful psychological forces that have been dormant in the unconscious. When these forces emerge without proper understanding or preparation, they don't enlighten, they overwhelm. Jung called this the flooding of consciousness, and he spent his career developing ways to navigate these waters safely. The first danger is already affecting many people who think they're awakening, mistaking the map for the territory. Jung discovered that one of the greatest dangers in spiritual awakening is what he called concretization of symbols, taking psychological and spiritual experiences literally rather than symbolically. When inner experiences are misunderstood as external reality, the awakening process can become confusing and potentially destabilizing. Here's what actually happens. During awakening, the unconscious produces powerful symbols, visions, and experiences. You might dream of divine figures, feel energy moving through your body, or have visions of spiritual realities. Jung discovered these are symbolic communications from the unconscious, meaningful but not literal. The danger comes when people interpret these symbols as concrete, external facts rather than internal psychological processes. Jung wrote, "The symbols of the unconscious are not literal truths, but psychological realities. To mistake them for external facts is to miss their true meaning and potentially lose oneself in fantasy rather than achieve genuine transformation." This danger manifests in specific ways Jung documented. Someone experiences a powerful dream of being chosen by divine forces and believes they're literally a chosen prophet. Rather than understanding it, symbolically represents their own potential awakening. They feel energy in their body and believe they're developing supernatural powers rather than recognizing natural psychological processes. They have visions of past lives and take them as literal history rather than symbolic representations of unconscious patterns. What makes this particularly challenging is that these experiences feel completely real, more real than ordinary life. The visions are vivid, the feelings are intense, the insights seem absolutely true. Jung understood this intensity as part of how the unconscious communicates, but he emphasized the crucial importance of what he called symbolic thinking. Understanding these experiences as meaningful metaphors rather than literal facts. Jung identified a specific framework for working with these experiences safely. He taught that when you encounter powerful spiritual experiences, you should ask, not, "Is this literally true?" but, "What is this symbolizing about my psychological process?" A vision of dying and being reborn isn't literal death, but symbolic of psychological transformation. Meeting a wise guide in meditation isn't encountering an external entity, but connecting with your own inner wisdom. The danger of literalization extends to spiritual teachings themselves. Jung observed people taking metaphorical teachings as literal instructions, symbolic maps as exact territories, poetic descriptions as scientific facts. This creates confusion when the literal interpretation doesn't match experience, leading some to doubt their entire journey or push harder toward impossible literal goals. Jung's approach was what he called holding the tension between literal and symbolic. You honor the power and reality of the experience while understanding it symbolically. The vision of light isn't dismissed as just imagination, nor taken as literal enlightenment. It's understood as the psyche's way of representing emerging consciousness. This danger is particularly acute in our current age, where spiritual experiences are often discussed without proper context. Jung warned that without understanding the symbolic nature of spiritual experience, people can become lost in what he called mythological thinking, living in a fantasy world of spiritual interpretations, rather than integrating spiritual insights into practical life. The key to navigating this danger is maintaining what Jung called psychological sophistication, the ability to think symbolically while remaining grounded in practical reality. This doesn't diminish the spiritual experience, but actually deepens it, revealing layers of meaning that literal interpretation would miss. But even when we understand experiences symbolically, another danger emerges: the premature return to wholeness. Jung identified a particularly subtle danger he called regressive restoration of the persona. When the challenges of awakening become overwhelming, there's a powerful temptation to retreat into an even more rigid version of who you were before. This isn't just stepping back. It's psychological armoring that can block future growth for years or decades. Here's what makes this so dangerous. Spiritual awakening requires dismantling your false self, facing your shadow, and experiencing temporary psychological chaos. When this becomes too intense, the psyche's survival mechanism can trigger what Jung called defensive crystallization, rapidly rebuilding and reinforcing old patterns stronger than before. Jung wrote, "The danger is not that awakening will fail, but that it will trigger such defensive consolidation that future attempts become nearly impossible. The psyche, once burned by premature opening, creates barriers that can take years to dissolve." This defensive return manifests in recognizable patterns Jung documented. Someone begins awakening, encounters their shadow, or experiences ego dissolution, becomes frightened, and suddenly becomes more rigid than before. The former spiritual seeker becomes aggressively materialistic. The person who glimpsed oneness becomes extremely boundaried and separate. The one who started questioning everything becomes fundamentalist about their previous beliefs. What's particularly challenging about this danger is that it often feels like relief. After the uncertainty and chaos of early awakening, returning to familiar patterns, even unhealthy ones, feels safe. The ego, threatened by transformation, convinces you that awakening was dangerous, delusional, or wrong. Jung called this the ego's revenge, using the very energy of awakening to build stronger defenses against it. Jung observed that this regression is often rationalized as being practical or returning to reality. People tell themselves they were being unrealistic, that spiritual seeking was escapism, that they need to focus on real life. But Jung understood this as the psyche's defense mechanism against the threat of genuine change. The danger extends beyond individual psychology. Jung noted that people who experience this regressive restoration often become actively hostile toward spirituality and awakening. Having been burned by their own premature or misunderstood experience, they project this fear onto others, warning against or mocking spiritual pursuits. They become what Jung called negative missionaries, unconsciously dedicated to preventing others from awakening. This creates a particularly tragic situation. The very experience meant to expand consciousness becomes the reason for its constriction. The glimpse of freedom becomes the cause of deeper imprisonment. The opening becomes the reason for more complete closure. Jung emphasized that avoiding this danger requires what he called graduated awakening, taking the process slowly, integrating each stage before moving forward. He compared it to deep sea diving. Ascending too quickly causes the bends. In psychological terms, expanding consciousness too rapidly causes defensive collapse. The key is recognizing that temporary retreat is different from regressive restoration. It's natural and healthy to sometimes step back, integrate, and rest. The danger is when stepping back becomes building walls, when integration becomes rigidification, when rest becomes permanent sleep. Yet, even when we avoid regressive restoration, another danger awaits, losing the ground while seeking the sky. Jung discovered a danger he called spiritual inflation without grounding. When people become so identified with transcendent experiences that they lose connection with practical life, body, and human responsibilities. They literally float away from Earth while believing they're ascending to heaven. Here's what creates this danger. Spiritual awakening often brings experiences of expansion, transcendence, and unity that feel infinitely more meaningful than ordinary life. The temptation is to pursue only these peak experiences while neglecting what Jung called the equally sacred ground of everyday existence. This creates psychological imbalance that can lead to practical life collapse. Jung wrote, "The person who seeks only transcendence without grounding becomes what I call psychologically homeless, unable to inhabit either earth or heaven fully. They float in a liminal space that provides neither the satisfaction of embodiment nor the fulfillment of genuine transcendence." This ungrounding manifests in specific ways Jung documented throughout his career. People neglect their physical health while pursuing spiritual heights, ignoring body signals as merely physical. They abandon practical responsibilities, work, relationships, finances, considering them unspiritual concerns. They lose the ability to engage with ordinary life, finding everything except peak spiritual experiences meaningless. What makes this particularly dangerous is that it often feels like spiritual progress. The more disconnected from ordinary life, the more spiritual the person believes they've become. Jung observed this creates what he called pseudo-transcendence, a dissociated state that mimics enlightenment, but is actually a form of psychological fragmentation. Jung identified specific signs of dangerous ungrounding: inability to maintain employment or stable living situations, dismissing practical concerns as illusions while suffering real consequences, losing connection with the body and its needs, believing you're beyond human limitations and requirements, and what Jung called spiritual bypassing, using transcendent ideas to avoid dealing with practical or psychological issues. The physical consequences can be severe. Jung documented cases of people who became so ungrounded they neglected basic self-care, developed health problems from ignoring their bodies, lost homes, and relationships through practical neglect, and experienced what he called energetic depletion, burnout from constantly reaching for transcendent states without grounding. Jung emphasized that genuine spiritual development requires what he called the union of opposites, transcendence and embodiment, spirit and matter, heaven and earth. He believed the goal wasn't to escape the human condition, but to fully inhabit it while maintaining connection to transcendent dimensions. The key to avoiding this danger is what Jung called conscious embodiment, deliberately grounding spiritual insights in practical life. This means honoring the body as sacred vessel, treating daily responsibilities as spiritual practice, finding the divine in ordinary moments, and maintaining what Jung called feet on the ground, head in the stars, simultaneous connection to earth and heaven. Jung's own life exemplified this balance. Despite his profound spiritual experiences, he maintained his psychiatric practice, fulfilled family responsibilities, engaged with practical matters, and emphasized that individuation happens through life, not despite it. As challenging as ungrounding is, there's an even subtler danger. If you're recognizing these dangers, literalization of symbols, regressive restoration, spiritual ungrounding, you're developing what Jung called conscious discrimination, the ability to navigate awakening safely. Understanding dangers isn't fear, but wisdom. Before we explore the final two hidden dangers, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share in the comments which danger you've witnessed or experienced. Your awareness might help others navigate more safely. Now, these last two dangers reveal why Jung believed professional guidance is often necessary. The dark night that never ends. Jung identified a particularly challenging danger he called arrested dissolution, when the necessary breakdown that precedes breakthrough gets stuck, leaving someone in perpetual psychological dissolution without reformation. The dark night of the soul becomes a permanent midnight with no dawn in sight. Here's what creates this danger. Authentic awakening requires what Jung called temporary ego death, the dissolution of old psychological structures before new ones can form. But sometimes this process arrests midway. The old self has dissolved, but the new self hasn't crystallized. The person remains in what Jung called psychological limbo, neither who they were nor who they are becoming. Jung wrote, "The dissolution phase of transformation is meant to be temporary, a passage, not a residence. When it becomes permanent, the person exists in a state of perpetual psychological crisis without resolution." This arrested dissolution manifests in specific ways Jung documented. The person experiences ongoing identity confusion, unable to answer basic questions about who they are or what they want. They have chronic emptiness that isn't the fertile void of transformation, but barren psychological wasteland. They lose the ability to make decisions, form relationships, or engage with life, not from conscious choice but from psychological inability. What makes this danger particularly challenging is that it can be mistaken for spiritual progress. The ego dissolution feels like the ego death described in spiritual texts. The emptiness seems like Buddhist emptiness. The inability to engage appears like non-attachment. But Jung distinguished these states. Healthy spiritual development involves dissolution followed by reintegration, while arrested dissolution is psychological fragmentation without resolution. Jung identified several factors that can cause arrested dissolution. Moving too quickly through the awakening process without proper integration causes psychological structures to collapse faster than they can rebuild. Lack of proper support or guidance leaves the person alone in psychological chaos without navigation tools. Trauma or unresolved psychological issues can hijack the dissolution process, turning transformation into re-traumatization. The subjective experience of arrested dissolution is particularly difficult. Every day feels like psychological death without rebirth. Identity remains fluid to the point of non-existence. The person can't return to who they were, but can't move forward to who they're becoming. Jung called this the torture of perpetual becoming without being. Jung emphasized that this danger requires what he called active intervention. It rarely resolves spontaneously. The person needs skilled guidance to complete the arrested process, rebuild psychological structures, and integrate the dissolution experience. This often requires professional support from someone familiar with both psychological and spiritual development. The key to avoiding arrested dissolution is what Jung called contained transformation, ensuring you have adequate support structures before beginning deep work. This includes therapeutic relationship, spiritual community, grounding practices, and what Jung called ego strength. Sufficient psychological stability to weather the dissolution phase. Jung also stressed the importance of titration, taking the process slowly enough that each dissolution is followed by integration before the next phase begins. He compared it to digestion. You must fully process one meal before eating another, or psychological indigestion occurs. Yet even when dissolution and reintegration proceed properly, one final danger remains: becoming a stranger to humanity. Jung's final danger is perhaps the most poignant. He called it the isolation of individuation, when genuine awakening creates such psychological differentiation that connecting with others becomes nearly impossible. You become so psychologically developed that you can no longer relate to ordinary consciousness, creating profound loneliness. Here's what makes this so challenging. Authentic awakening fundamentally changes your psychological structure. You see differently, feel differently, value differently. What Jung called the problem of the awakened is that this difference can create an unbridgeable gulf between you and those still operating from conventional consciousness. Jung wrote, "The individuated person faces a particular form of isolation, not from failure, but from success. Having achieved psychological integration, they find few who can meet them at their level of development." This isolation manifests in painful ways, Jung observed. Conversations feel hollow because others can't engage with the depths you now inhabit. Relationships become challenging because you see unconscious patterns others don't recognize. Social situations feel artificial because you can't participate in collective unconsciousness. You understand others but feel fundamentally misunderstood. What's particularly difficult is that this isn't arrogance or superiority. It's simply psychological reality. Jung compared it to an adult trying to engage meaningfully with children's games. You can participate superficially, but can't genuinely engage at that level because you've developmentally moved beyond it. Jung identified specific aspects of this isolation. Language itself becomes problematic. The words exist to describe ordinary experience, not awaken consciousness. You find yourself unable to communicate your most important insights because the vocabulary doesn't exist. When you try to explain, Others either don't understand or misinterpret based on their own level of development. The isolation extends to life choices. Your values have shifted so fundamentally that conventional goals seem meaningless. Career paths that once attracted you feel empty. Social activities that once engaged you seem pointless. Relationships that once nourished you feel limiting, not because you're judging them, but because you've genuinely outgrown them. Jung observed that many awakened individuals experience what he called the burden of consciousness. Seeing clearly brings responsibility and often pain. You see the suffering others create unconsciously. You understand the patterns they're trapped in. You recognize the potential they're not living. But you often can't help because intervention requires readiness they haven't reached. This creates what Jung called the awakened person's dilemma: how to remain connected to humanity while being fundamentally different. Some resolve this through service, finding meaning in helping others awaken. Others through creative expression, channeling their insights into art or writing. Some through what Jung called conscious ordinariness, deliberately engaging with conventional life while maintaining inner differentiation. Jung emphasized that this isolation isn't failure, but what he called the price of consciousness. Every expansion of awareness creates distance from those who haven't expanded. Every integration creates difference from those who remain fragmented. Every awakening creates separation from those still sleeping. The key to managing this danger is what Jung called compassionate differentiation, maintaining your development while finding ways to bridge to others. This might mean finding the few others at similar developmental levels, expressing your insights in forms others can receive, or accepting the isolation as part of your journey while still maintaining human warmth. Here's Jung's complete picture of awakening's hidden dangers: mistaking symbols for literal reality, regressive restoration to old patterns, losing grounding while seeking transcendence, getting stuck in perpetual dissolution, and becoming isolated through differentiation. These aren't reasons to avoid awakening, but realities to navigate consciously. Jung wrote, "The dangers of individuation are real, but so is the danger of not individuating. The risk of awakening must be weighed against the certainty of sleeping through life. These dangers serve an important function. They're not flaws in the awakening process, but necessary challenges that ensure only genuine transformation occurs. Each danger tests different aspects of development: symbolic thinking, courage to continue, balance of opposites, integration capacity, and ability to bridge differences." Jung believed that understanding these dangers is the best protection against them. When you know that symbols might be literalized, you maintain symbolic thinking. When you recognize regression is possible, you move slowly with support. When you understand ungrounding risks, you maintain embodiment. When you see dissolution can arrest, you ensure integration. When you know isolation may come, you prepare for it. What Jung emphasized repeatedly is that these dangers are navigable with proper understanding and support. He developed analytical psychology specifically to provide frameworks for safe awakening. He believed that with the right knowledge and guidance, the individuation process could proceed with minimal risk. Jung saw these dangers not as arguments against awakening, but as reasons for taking it seriously. Spiritual development isn't a casual pursuit, but a fundamental reorganization of the psyche that requires respect, preparation, and often professional support. If you're navigating these dangers, if you're struggling with symbolic confusion, defensive regression, spiritual ungrounding, arrested dissolution, or awakened isolation, you're not failing. You're discovering why Jung called individuation the most difficult and important journey a human can undertake. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to explore more of Jung's guidance for safe awakening. To dive even deeper into Jung's revolutionary psychology and what it means for your spiritual awakening, click the recommended video on your screen now.